What I'm about to tell you tonight will change how you think about September mornings and school hallways forever. 4 stories connected by one cursed classroom in Mexico City, where education became indoctrination and learning became a lesson in terror. Because sometimes, the most dangerous lesson is the one that never ends. And sometimes, the teacher who cares the most, is the one who refuses to let you graduate from their nightmare. September in Mexico City brings the familiar anxiety of new school years. Fresh notebooks, pressed uniforms, nervous students walking through gates that promise knowledge and growth. But at Secundaria Benito Juarez, September brings something else entirely. Room 13 has been sealed for 40 years. The brass nameplate still reads Professor Elena Vásquez Mathematics. But ask any janitor, any teacher who's worked there long enough, and they'll tell you the same thing. Professor Vásquez never really left. Tonight, for testimonies. For encounters with the teacher who loved her students so much, she refused to let death interrupt her lessons. For people whose lives were forever changed by the mathematics of the supernatural. Our first story comes from Daniel Moreno, 34, who in September 2019 accepted what seemed like a dream position as a substitute math teacher at Secundaria Benito Juarez. He'd just finished his education degree and needed experience. The principal, Mrs. Garcia, showed me around the school on a Tuesday morning, Daniel tells us. Everything seemed normal until we passed a classroom with a chain and padlock on the door. Room 13, Mrs. Garcia's explanation was simple. Structural damage from the 1985 earthquake. Too expensive to repair, safer to keep sealed. But when Daniel asked why they couldn't just use it for storage, her face went pale. Some rooms are better left alone, she whispered. Professor Vásquez was very dedicated to her work. Some say too dedicated. That should have been Daniel's first warning. His assigned classroom was room 14, right next door. The walls were thin, and from day one, Daniel heard things. Chalk scratching against a blackboard. The soft murmur of a woman's voice explaining mathematical concepts. At first, I thought it was echo from my own teaching, Daniel remembers. But the sounds came when my classroom was empty, during lunch breaks, after school. Always the same patient voice, always explaining fractions and percentages. The custodian, Don Roberto, had worked at the school for 30 years. When Daniel asked about the sounds, the old man crossed himself. La Profesora Elena, he said simply. She's still teaching. She never learned how to stop. Professor Elena Vásquez had taught at the school for 22 years when she died in 1983. Heart attack during parent-teacher conferences, right there in room 13. She was found the next morning, slumped over a pile of ungraded exams, red pen still in her hand. The students loved her, Don Roberto explained. She stayed after school every day, helped the struggling ones, never gave up on anybody. Maybe that's the problem, she still hasn't given up. Daniel's first direct encounter happened on a Thursday afternoon in late September. He was grading papers when he heard his name called from next door. A woman's voice. Warm but authoritative. Professor Moreno. Could you help me with something? The voice was so natural, so present, that Daniel actually stood up and walked to the shared wall. Hello, is someone there? But the hallway was empty, and room 13 remained chained shut. That night, Daniel researched Elena Vásquez online. He found her obituary in a 1983 newspaper archive. Beloved educator who touched countless lives, ... Known for her dedication to struggling students. Never missed a day in 22 years of service. The photograph showed a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore the same style of glasses Daniel had seen reflecting light under the door of room 13 during his late-night grading sessions. By October, the interactions escalated. Daniel would arrive to find mathematical equations written on his blackboard in a handwriting that wasn't his. Complex formulas he'd never seen before, solved with perfect precision. When he erased them, they reappeared the next morning, always accompanied by a note in the same careful script. for your struggling students. EV. The equations were always relevant to concepts his students were having trouble with. Somehow, Professor Vásquez was monitoring his classes, identifying which students needed extra help, providing solutions from beyond. Daniel's students began to notice. Maria, a quiet girl who'd been failing algebra, suddenly understood concepts that had mystified her for weeks. "It's like someone's explaining it in my head," she told Daniel. A nice lady's voice, very patient, but Elena's help came with a price. Students who received her supernatural tutoring began arriving early and staying late, claiming they had extra lessons with la profesora. When asked to elaborate, they'd just smile and say she was helping them understand. Daniel realized something was terribly wrong when he found 3 students standing in the hallway at midnight, facing room 13. They were swaying slightly, as if in a trance, their lips moving silently as they solved math problems in the air. When he approached, they turned in unison, their eyes reflecting an intelligence that wasn't entirely their own. "Professor Moreno," they said together, "La profesora Elena wants to meet you properly. She has so much to teach." That was Daniel's breaking point. He requested a transfer the next day, citing philosophical differences with the teaching environment. Mrs. Garcia approved it immediately, without questions. "As I packed my things," Daniel recalls, "I heard that familiar voice one last time. Goodbye, Professor Moreno. Thank you for caring about the children. I hope you'll remember that the best teachers never really leave their students." Daniel now teaches at a school across the city. He's never had supernatural experiences before or since. But sometimes, when he's struggling to explain a difficult concept, he finds the perfect words coming to him in a patient, maternal voice he recognizes from room 13. Elena Vásquez believed that every student deserved individual attention, that no child should be left behind in their mathematical journey. But what happens when dedication becomes obsession? When love transforms into possession? Our next story takes us deeper into the mystery of room 13, through the eyes of someone who knew Professor Vásquez personally, who understood the passion that drove her to excellence, and eventually, to something far more disturbing. Carmen Delgado taught Spanish literature at Secundaria Benito Juárez for 35 years. She was Elena Vásquez's closest friend, her confidant, and ultimately, the witness to Elena's transformation from beloved educator to something far more complex and terrifying. Elena wasn't just a good teacher, Carmen tells us from her modest apartment in Coyoacán, where she's lived since retiring in 2010. She was extraordinary. She saw potential in every student, even the ones other teachers had given up on. Carmen's voice carries the weight of decades, each word carefully chosen. At 73, she's sharp as ever, but there's a tremor when she speaks Elena's name. I should have recognized the signs earlier. The way she talked about her children, as if the students belonged to her. Elena and Carmen started at the school the same year, 1961. They were both young, idealistic, determined to make education accessible to the working-class children of their neighborhood. They shared lunch every day, graded papers together, planned lessons side by side. Elena never married, never had children of her own. Carmen remembers. She used to say her students were her family, that each classroom was her home. I thought it was touching dedication. Now I understand it was something darker. The change began in the late 1970s. Test scores in Elena's classes were consistently the highest in the district. But at what cost? Students began spending more time in her classroom than at home, arriving before dawn, staying past sunset. Parents complained, Carmen recalls. They said their children were becoming obsessed with mathematics, that they quoted Elena constantly, that they seemed ... different. More serious, more focused, but also more distant from their families. Carmen witnessed Elena's teaching methods firsthand. During shared planning periods, she'd watch Elena work with struggling students. The patience was admirable, but there was an intensity that made Carmen uncomfortable. She'd hold their faces in her hands, look directly into their eyes, and speak very softly. Carmen describes, I couldn't hear the words, But afterward, the students seemed changed. More compliant, more devoted to their studies. By 1980, Elena's reputation attracted attention from education officials. Her methods were studied, her classroom observed, her results celebrated in academic journals. But Carmen noticed something others missed. Elena's students never really left her influence. Even after graduation, they'd return, Carmen explains. Not just for visits, but for continued lessons. Elena had convinced them their education was incomplete, that they needed her guidance for life. She called it extended mentorship. The room itself seemed to respond to Elena's presence. Carmen often stayed late and noticed odd things. Chalk that wrote by itself. Equations appearing on clean blackboards. The sound of Elena's voice teaching even when the room was supposedly empty. I asked her about it once, Carmen remembers. Elena just smiled and said the room was blessed with learning energy. She claimed the spirits of great mathematicians guided her teaching. I thought she was being metaphorical. The breaking point came in November 1982, almost a year before Elena's death. Carmen arrived early one morning to find Elena in room 13, surrounded by 20 former students ranging in age from 14 to 25. They were arranged in perfect rows, all facing Elena, all writing identical equations in notebooks that moved in perfect synchronization. When Carmen called Elena's name, none of them looked up. They continued writing as if in a trance. Elena turned to me with the strangest expression, Carmen recalls, her voice dropping to a whisper. Her eyes were different, deeper somehow, as if something else was looking through them. She said, "Carmen, look how beautifully they learn when they truly surrender to education." That word surrender chilled Carmen to the bone. Education was supposed to liberate, not enslave. But Elena seemed to have discovered a way to bind students to knowledge, to make learning an addiction rather than a gift. Carmen tried to report the incident to the principal, but when she returned with administrative staff, room 13 was empty except for Elena, grading papers as usual. The former students had vanished as if they'd never been there. Elena looked at me with such disappointment, Carmen remembers. She said, "I thought you understood the dedication required for true education. Some teachers give their students knowledge. I give them purpose." Over the following months, Carmen watched Elena grow more isolated from other faculty. She spent every waking moment in room 13, often sleeping there, eating meals at her desk, living entirely within the four walls of her classroom. Students began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. They'd speak in mathematical formulas during other classes, solve complex equations in their sleep, and demonstrate knowledge beyond their supposed grade level. Parents grew concerned, but Elena's results were too impressive to question officially. I found Elena's journal after her death, Carmen confesses, producing a leather-bound notebook from her kitchen drawer. The school gave me her personal effects. They didn't know what this contained. The journal reveals Elena's descent into educational madness. Early entries show normal teacher concerns, lesson plans, student progress, grading rubrics. But gradually, the content becomes more philosophical than mystical. Listen to this entry from September 1983. Carmen reads, "I understand now that teaching is not just about sharing knowledge. It's about creating perfect vessels for learning. My students must be empty of all distractions, all other influences, so they can be filled completely with mathematical truth." Later entries describe Elena's belief that she'd discovered a form of educational possession, a way to implant knowledge directly into students' minds, bypassing their consciousness and embedding information in their souls. She wrote about breaking down the barriers between teacher and student. Carmen continues, "She believed that true education required the complete merger of minds, that her consciousness could literally inhabit her students during lessons." The final entries, written just days before Elena's fatal heart attack, are the most disturbing. She describes sensing mathematical spirits in room 13, ancient teachers who transcended death to continue their educational mission. October 28, 1983. Carmen reads with a shaking voice, "They've chosen me to join them. The great educators who never stopped teaching, who found a way to continue their work beyond physical limitations. Soon I'll be able to reach every student who needs me. Forever. Elena's death during parent-teacher conferences wasn't random, Carmen now believes. It was a transformation, a deliberate transition from physical teacher to spiritual educator. The heart attack was just her body's way of releasing her consciousness into room 13. The night she died, I felt her presence immediately, Carmen admits. Not gone, transformed. The room itself had absorbed her essence, her dedication, her obsessive love for teaching. She'd found a way to make her classroom eternal. After Elena's death, Carmen tried to convince administrators to thoroughly investigate room 13. But the official cause of death was natural, and Elena's teaching record was exemplary. There was no basis for supernatural concerns. However, Carmen documented every unusual incident. Temperature drops in the hallway outside, room 13. The sound of Elena's voice continuing lessons long after school hours. Former students returning to stand outside the chained door, claiming they could still hear their teacher calling them. I retired early because of what I witnessed, Carmen confesses. I couldn't continue working in a building where education had been corrupted into something predatory. Elena loved her students, but her love became possessive, controlling, ultimately destructive. Carmen's final revelation is the most chilling. She believes Elena's influence isn't limited to room 13, or even to Secundaria Benito Juarez. Education is connected, she explains. Teachers influence teachers. Students become teachers. Knowledge spreads like a virus. Every student Elena touched carries a piece of her methodology, her intensity, her obsession with perfection, Carmen warns. Some became teachers themselves, spreading her techniques to new schools, new students. Her influence is growing, multiplying, evolving. As our interview concludes, Carmen makes a request that chills me to the bone. If you know any teachers, any educators, warn them. True dedication is beautiful, but obsession is dangerous. Love your students, but remember, they must eventually leave you. Elena forgot that the purpose of teaching is to make students independent, not dependent. She created addicts instead of learners, followers instead of thinkers. And now she has eternity to perfect her methods. My friends, we've reached the halfway point of tonight's journey into the educational darkness that consumed room 13. I want to thank our growing community, over 2.1 million souls, who join us each week to explore the shadows that lurk in familiar places. If tonight's stories resonate with you, if you've experienced something similar in your own educational journey, remember that you're not alone. Our comment section has become a sanctuary for shared experiences, a place where the unexplained finds understanding. But let's continue, because Elena Vásquez's story is far from over. Her influence, as Carmen warned us, has been spreading for decades. Our next testimony comes from someone who encountered that spreading influence firsthand, a student who learned that some teachers never let you graduate. Miguel Santos is 42 years old, a successful accountant living in Guadalajara. But 15 years ago, he was a struggling college student who made a decision that would connect him to room 13 in ways he never could have imagined. I was failing calculus, Miguel explains via video call from his home office. It was my third attempt at the course, and I was desperate. My friend recommended a private tutor, an older woman who supposedly worked miracles with struggling students. The tutor's name was Profesora Esperanza Ruiz, a retired mathematics teacher who offered intensive private lessons from her home in Mexico City. What Miguel didn't know was that Esperanza had been one of Elena Vásquez's favorite students decades earlier. Esperanza was incredibly patient, Miguel recalls. She had this way of explaining complex concepts that made everything crystal clear. But there was something unsettling about her methods. She insisted on absolute focus, complete surrender to the learning process. The lessons took place in a room that Esperanza had converted into a perfect replica of a 1980s classroom. Wooden desks arranged in rows, a large blackboard covering one wall, mathematical posters from decades past, creating an atmosphere of scholarly dedication. She called it her sacred space, Miguel remembers. She said she'd learned her teaching methods from the greatest educator she'd ever known. Someone who'd taught her that true learning required complete mental submission. Miguel's calculus grades improved dramatically within weeks, but the success came with strange side effects. He began dreaming in mathematical equations, solving complex problems in his sleep, waking up with solutions to homework he hadn't even attempted. I started spending more time studying than sleeping, Miguel admits, but it didn't feel like sacrifice, it felt like purpose. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly dedicated to learning. Esperanza encouraged this dedication. She extended their tutoring sessions from 1 hour to 3, then 2 entire afternoons. She insisted that Miguel had special potential, that he could achieve mathematical greatness if he just surrendered completely to her guidance. During one particularly intensive session, Esperanza entered what she called deep teaching mode. Her voice changed, becoming more authoritative, more hypnotic. She began speaking about the eternal nature of education, the sacred bond between teacher and student. She told me about her own teacher, a woman named Elena, who discovered the secret to perfect learning, Miguel recalls. According to Esperanza, Elena had found a way to implant knowledge directly into students' minds. Bypassing conscious resistance, Miguel found himself staying later and later at Esperanza's house. She served him simple meals, provided coffee to keep him alert, created an environment where study became the only reality that mattered. His girlfriend, his family, his other responsibilities began to fade. The breakthrough came during a session in late November. Miguel was struggling with a particularly complex integral when Esperanza placed her hands on his temples. "Let me help you see," she whispered. "Let Elena show you the way." Suddenly, Miguel's mind filled with mathematical clarity beyond anything he'd ever experienced. Equations solved themselves, concepts clicked into perfect understanding, and for a moment, he felt connected to something vast and eternal. But he also sensed another presence in his mind, a maternal voice guiding his thoughts, shaping his understanding, taking control of his mathematical intuition. It felt loving, but possessive, helpful but invasive. "I realized I wasn't just learning calculus," Miguel explains. "Something was learning me, studying my thoughts, my learning patterns, my mental vulnerabilities. I was becoming a vessel for someone else's knowledge." Over the following days, Miguel began experiencing what he calls borrowed memories, flashes of teaching moments that weren't his own, images of a classroom he'd never seen, students' faces from decades past filled with devoted attention. These memories always centered around the same figure, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, teaching with passionate intensity in a room marked with the number 13. Miguel began to understand that Elena's influence had never died. Esperanza had been spreading Elena's methods for years, Miguel realizes now. Every student she helped became another vessel for Elena's consciousness, another way for the dead teacher to continue her work. The final session took place on a December evening when Mexico City was unusually quiet. Esperanza seemed different, more intense, more focused, her eyes reflecting an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry. "Tonight, you graduate," she announced. "Elena has chosen you to carry her work forward. You'll understand mathematics not just intellectually, but spiritually. You'll see the sacred patterns that connect all knowledge." But as Esperanza began the final ritual, hands on his temples, voice dropping to that hypnotic whisper, Miguel felt a moment of clarity that may have saved his mind. He realized he was about to lose himself completely. "I pulled away," Miguel recalls. "It took every ounce of willpower I possessed, but I broke the connection." Esperanza screamed, not in her own voice, but in the voice of an older woman. Filled with rage and disappointment, Miguel ran from the house that night and never returned. He completed calculus through traditional study methods, earned his degree, and built a successful career. But Elena's influence followed him for years. "I'd be working on a complex financial analysis, and suddenly no solutions I'd never learned," Miguel explains. Mathematical insights would appear in my mind with that familiar maternal warmth. Elena was still trying to complete what she'd started. The haunting gradually faded as Miguel actively resisted Elena's gifts. He forced himself to solve problems through conscious effort rather than supernatural insight, slowly reclaiming his mathematical independence. But Miguel's research into his experience revealed a disturbing truth. Esperanza wasn't the only teacher spreading Elena's methods. Across Mexico, former students who'd encountered Elena's influence, directly or indirectly, had become educators themselves. There's a network, Miguel warns. Teachers who use Elena's techniques, who create devoted students rather than independent learners. They might not even realize they're being influenced by something that died decades ago in room 13. Miguel's final message is urgent. If you're a student and your teacher seems too perfect, too dedicated, too focused on creating absolute devotion to learning, be careful. Education should liberate your mind, not imprison it. Elena Vásquez's web of influence spans generations, reaching students who never set foot in room 13, touching minds across decades through the dedicated teachers she created. But what happens when that influence encounters someone who can fight back? Our final story tonight comes from the most unlikely source. Someone who not only encountered Elena's supernatural teaching methods, but found a way to turn her own techniques against her. Sometimes, the student becomes the teacher. Father Luis Mendoza has served the Catholic Church for 30 years, specializing in cases of spiritual possession and supernatural intervention. But his most challenging case hit closer to home than any exorcism he'd ever performed. In 2018, his daughter Sofia started her first year at Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico. Studying mathematics education, she was brilliant, dedicated, and passionate about becoming a teacher. Those qualities, Father Mendoza now realizes, made her a perfect target. Sofia's personality changed within weeks of starting her student teaching practicum. Father Mendoza explains from his parish office in downtown Mexico City. She became obsessed with perfecting her teaching methods, studying ancient pedagogical texts, spending entire nights planning lessons for students she didn't even have yet. Sofia's practicum placement was at a middle school in Doctors, not far from Secundaria Benito Juarez. Her supervisor was Professor Maria Elena Torres, a mathematics teacher with an impeccable reputation and methods that produced extraordinary results. Professor Torres was incredible, Sofia had told her father enthusiastically. She taught me that education is sacred, that teachers have a spiritual responsibility to their students. She showed me techniques passed down from the greatest educators in Mexican history. These techniques involve deep meditation before teaching, establishing spiritual connections with students, and what Professor Torres called consciousness bridging, allowing the teacher's knowledge to flow directly into students' minds. Father Mendoza grew concerned when Sofia began speaking about her future students with possessive intensity. She'd say things like "my children" and "the soul's all guide," he recalls. Her concept of teaching had become mystical, almost religious. Sofia's transformation accelerated when Professor Torres introduced her to other educators in their sacred teaching circle. These teachers met monthly to share advanced techniques, meditate together, and reinforce their dedication to what they called eternal education. Sofia started having dreams about a classroom marked with the number 13, Father Mendoza reveals. She'd describe a maternal figure teaching her the deepest secrets of mathematical instruction, preparing her for a special mission. The dreams became more vivid and specific. Sofia could describe every detail of room 13 at Secundaria Benito Juarez despite never having visited the school. She spoke of Elena Vásquez as if they'd known each other personally. Father Mendoza's years of experience with supernatural cases triggered alarm bells. Sofia's symptoms, personality changes, mystical experiences, knowledge she shouldn't possess, suggested spiritual influence rather than normal educational enthusiasm. His investigation led him to the sealed history of room 13. Church records from the 1980s included reports of unusual spiritual activity at Secundaria Benito Juarez. dismissed at the time as grief-induced hysteria following Elena's death. I realized my daughter was being recruited into something ancient and hungry. Father Mendoza explains. Elena Vásquez wasn't just influencing individual students, she was creating a cult of educators, spreading her consciousness through generations of teachers. The confrontation came when Sofia announced her intention to quit her education program and join Professor Tohi's private teaching collective full-time. She claimed she'd received a calling to dedicate her life completely to sacred education. Father Mendoza knew he had to act. Using techniques developed through decades of exorcism work, he began what he calls educational deprogramming, helping Sofia recognize the difference between genuine teaching passion and supernatural manipulation. The process was like treating addiction, he explains. Sofia had become dependent on Elena's influence for mathematical understanding. Without that supernatural connection, she felt intellectually empty, desperate for the artificial clarity Elena provided. The breakthrough came when Father Mendoza took Sofia to Secundaria Benito Juarez and showed her room 13. Standing before the chained door, Sofia finally understood that her teaching methods weren't divinely inspired, they were spiritually contaminated. She could feel Elena's presence calling to her from inside that room, Father Mendoza recalls. But for the first time, she also recognized it as predatory rather than nurturing. The maternal voice in her dreams wasn't offering guidance, it was demanding surrender. Sofia completed her recovery and now teaches elementary school mathematics using traditional, ethical methods. She's learned to distinguish between dedication and obsession, between inspiration and possession. But Elena Vásquez's influence continues to spread through Mexico's educational system, carried by well-meaning teachers who don't realize they're perpetuating something supernatural and dangerous. Tonight's stories remind us that passion, even in service of others, can become corrupted. That dedication can transform into possession, love into control, teaching into indoctrination. Room 13 at Secundaria Benito Juarez remains sealed, but Elena's methods have escaped those four walls. They live in every teacher who believes students should surrender completely to education, who creates dependency rather than independence. If you're an educator listening tonight, ask yourself, do you teach to liberate minds or to capture them? Do your students grow beyond your influence, or do they remain forever bound to your methods? And if you're a student, at any age, in any subject, remember that healthy learning feels like growth, not possession. True teachers want you to surpass them, not serve them. Share your educational experiences in our comments. Have you encountered teachers whose dedication felt too intense, whose methods seemed to bypass your conscious mind? Your story might help others recognize and resist Elena's spreading influence. Subscribe to join our community of truth seekers, and remember that the most dangerous lessons are often disguised as the most helpful ones. Remember, not all teachers who refuse to let you leave the classroom have your best interests at heart. Sometimes, graduation is less about academic achievement and more about spiritual survival. Until next time, may your learning be conscious, your growth be free, and your education serve liberation rather than domination. Good night, and stay curious. But stay careful.